in a very catastrophic way, what seems like an awful long time ago, but in fact, there are some extraordinary parallels with what's happening today. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So can I just make sure that everyone can see that image? Just somebody shout out.
Yes, we can.
Great, excellent. So what I'm going to talk about very briefly really is this extraordinary event that has been nicknamed the Great Dying. And it happened, as you can see, 252 million years ago. And it was the greatest mass extinction the Earth has ever suffered in deep time. Now, whether we are facing something of a similar magnitude, of course, is very much debated, but I think it's pretty likely that we are certainly we have initiated a path which is of the same severity as this mass extinction. Now, of course, this mass extinction was entirely natural, if you like, and without doubt, the current mass extinction is being mediated via society and the activity of humans. What part of the work, this topic was actually considered by a PhD student of mine called Matt Clarkson, and I'm not going to show you all his detailed data because it's all very geological and specific and geochemical. But one of the things he did is that he collaborated with a linoprint artist in the Art Science Collaborative. And this image you can see here, this rather revolting image, is of a rotting fish, but a fish that lived 250 million years ago, or 260 million years ago, I should say. And this was just to epitomize this mass extinction. And in fact, the frontispiece of his PhD thesis and every chapter had one of these wonderful linoprints in it, which I thought was a terrific addition. I'm very much a believer that art and science are both very, very creative activities and can learn a lot from one another. So this is just an image of how we sometimes think about the history of life on Earth. And you think about there, the very beginning, hope you can see my cursor, is the oldest rocks on Earth are about 4.6 billion years old. And then we think the oldest life was something like 3.5 billion years old. Very, very simple life, just single cells, very simple cells. And then you can see this sort of spiral of life gaining in complexity. And at about 550 million years ago, this is when we see the first complex animals, rather like ourselves. And then we see the march of all these different types of life, some of which you may have heard of, like the trilobites. Here, circled here, is one of those fish I've just shown you. They're bony fish. They're fish that have particular bones in their skulls, and they're long extinct now. Here's the period of the dinosaurs, the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. And then, of course, we have the rise of mammals afterwards. And then humans are often shown as this sort of apparent pinnacle of evolution. But of course, philosophically, that's led to, or ethically, that's led to all sorts of the tragic situation we find our Earth in today, where humanity has really used the Earth, both its raw materials and its life, for its own purpose. Now, this change, this sort of slow increase in the evolution of complex life, with mammals really only appearing in the last few minutes, if you like, of the history of the Earth, is not just a monotonous increase in diversity. It's been hit by what we call mass extinctions. And the one I'm going to talk about today is one that hit about 252 million years ago. And it was the worst mass extinction that the Earth has ever suffered. And here's a sort of artist's reconstruction of what happened. It was really devastating for both life in the seas and life on land. And you can see some of these reconstructions of animals, of things that are very, very unfamiliar today. They all went extinct in this mass extinction. So for example, in the sea before, we had these beautiful reefs. Now today, reefs are formed by corals, but in fact, at this bit of time, they were formed by sponges and these brachiopods and all sorts of weird and wonderful looking animals. So this is a reconstruction actually made of plastic in the University of Michigan's Museum of Natural History. But the point is that these seas were teeming with life, very, very diverse, highly biodiverse systems. And after this mass extinction, there was very, very little left. So this is with my fingers in here, this is a field photograph of a bedding, a bit of sea floor. And all that's left after this mass extinction is this wrinkly structure. In fact, it's just an algal mat of a bit like the slime that you see at the bottom of a pond, and the odd shell here. Very, very few shells and only one species. And you can see here another example. The seafloor, the biodiversity absolutely plummeted. Just a very, very limited number of species. So you can see here, this is just one species, even though it's abundant, but it colonized the seafloor very rapidly. So in other words, the complexity of our ecosystems and the diversity absolutely plummeted. Very, very few. Just a few of what we call these disaster species that could survive in these very, very unusual post-extinction settings. So that's in the sea. On the land before, we have these very strange, huge reptiles, and they were eating this unusual type of vegetation. But afterwards, they absolutely went extinct. And a lot of that very early primitive vegetation, if you like, also went extinct. So this was a really devastating mass extinction. Now, as paleontologists, we often plot the history of biodiversity on the planet like this. So this is geological time. So this is now 540 million years ago. And you can see here right up to the present day here. And forget about the different colors here. These are different types of faunas, but just follow this line here. This is just simply actually numbers of major groups of animals. And you can see that they appeared at the beginning of what we call the Cambrian and the Cambrian explosion, an increase, but you can see that increase flattened out, and then we have this huge mass extinction where my red arrow is, and that's how much diversity was lost. Now the y-axis here is not in terms of species, it's in terms of major groups, and you can see that about half of all the major groups went extinct. And that represents between 90 and 95% of all species going extinct. It was really catastrophic. What caused it? Well, without doubt, what caused it were huge volcanic eruptions. So we know that a lot of mass extinctions in the past are caused by these huge areas of volcanic activity on land. And although what I've shown you here is a volcano, it's quite an unusual volcano because it's erupting over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And we've dated some of these huge volcanic systems that produce enormous amounts of lava at exactly the right age of when this mass extinction took place. And here is a map of North Siberia. So this is Russia. You can see here Scandinavia, so almost into Arctic Russia. And this area with the black line, all this area is a mass of this lava, all dated to around this time. And here's a photograph of what this lava looks like. It's pretty inaccessible because a lot of this area is only accessible during summer months when the snow has melted. And also these cliffs are only carved through the Siberian tundra by rivers. So you can only really access these areas by either helicopter, which is extremely expensive, or taking a boat down these rivers. But the point is that this is an enormous amount of volcanic activity, exactly the right age. Now, what's interesting about volcanoes is when they are, I'm just going to show you another figure now. So these volcanoes generally the ones that you might have heard of, like Stromboli and the Hawaiian volcanoes, they only erupt episodically, and they give off a lot of sulfur dioxide in the short term. Now, sulfur dioxide actually cools the planet over a very, very short time scale. But when you have these very, very long-lived eruptions on land, and they're known as traps. So what I'm talking about here are the Siberian traps. On a long time scale, by a long time scale, I mean hundreds and thousands of millions of years, they pump out a huge amount of carbon dioxide. And we all know that carbon dioxide is a very virulent greenhouse gas. So all this slightly complicated flow diagram shows is the consequences of when you have these huge eruptions on land. They produce in the long time scale a lot of carbon dioxide, and this leads to global warming. Now, the other thing that happens with global warming, you probably know that we have a huge amount of this very curious material called methane hydride, which is basically crystallized methane, and it's particularly common on bits of the earth which are very, very cold. So here are some photographs of these methane mounds, which are actually found again in the sea north of Siberia. So if you were snorkeling over the sea floor, you would see these curious mounds, and they're trapping an enormous amount of methane gas in a crystalline form because they are so cold. It's almost icy methane, and it's known as methane hydrates. Now, methane is at least a 20 times worse greenhouse gas than CO2. And one thing that's starting to happen on our planet now, we know that we are pumping out a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere by effectively short-circuiting the carbon cycle. And as if that wasn't bad enough, because the Earth is getting very, very warm, and it's getting particularly, as it gets particularly warm in the Arctic areas, these methane mounds are destabilizing. They are warming up, and they are starting to produce methane. And you can see here in the second image, all this methane being lost as a gas. So it's being lost. It's no longer trapped and stable in its mound. It's being lost into the sea and leaves the sea as bubbles. And many scientific ships have now reported moving over in those Siberian, in the Arctic waters, and seeing these huge bubbling mounds. The sea is literally boiling with methane. Extremely, extremely worrying. And you can see underneath here is a colleague lighting some methane in the Siberian tundra. And that's wouldn't have been possible until the late 20th century, when so much of the tundra is now starting to melt in effect, and these methane hydrates are destabilizing. So this is happening today, and this happened also 252 years ago. We have this, what is known as a runaway greenhouse. In other words, once the Earth heats up to such a point, you get all these other effects kicking in, like these methane hydrates destabilizing, producing even worse greenhouse gases, and so the world heats up even more. Now, two really significant things also happen when you warm the Earth. First of all, you create the ocean circulation starts to stagnate, and this means that parts of our seas start to lose their oxygen. They're no longer ventilated, and you get what's called anoxia. In other words, the shallow areas of the sea where a lot of marine life is living really start to reduce the amount of oxygen, and that leads to a mass extinction. And indeed, if you go all the way over the planet at this bit of time, you see the sediments change from these pale grey sediments, which are just really healthy oxic sediments, to this black layer here. And this black layer is basically the beginning of the mass extinction. I discovered, by the way, that anoxia is a name of a Norwegian heavy metal band. But anyway, in geology, anoxia is simply the loss of oxygen, the total loss of oxygen, and it leads to extinction. So this is one of the things that happen with this global warming, anoxia. And then secondly, the other thing that happens is that when you pump a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, the oceans also start to go acid. In other words, they start off by being, our oceans are naturally about a pH 8.2. And we worked out in this study, looking at the Permian, that the oceans actually went down to 7.4 pH. The pH scale is logarithmic, so that's a really dramatic change. Now, the worrying thing is that all these things are happening today. As if global warming wasn't enough, anoxia is developing in our shelf seas. In other words, the seas, which are very productive, are starting to lose their oxygen, and this is leading to the loss of life. The other thing that's happening is that our oceans are going acid. So as I said, pre-anthropogenic pH, let's say if you measured the pH of our seas in about the year 1700, would have been about 8.2. It's already gone down to 8.1. That's a very, very dramatic change in only 200 years or so, or 150 years. So there's an enormous amount of effort going on to see how things like corals from coral reefs are responding to increased CO2. And so these two things go in hand. Here is global warming, if you like, models, a 1 degree change, a 2 degree change, and a 3 degree change. And hand in hand goes the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is in equilibrium with the CO2 dissolved in the seas. So as you pump, if you rapidly pump CO2 into the atmosphere, you will cause the ocean to become acidic. So this is the amount of CO2 we had in the atmosphere maybe 20 years ago. The amount today, I haven't checked actually exactly today, but it's already over 410. So these are projected levels if we carry on as business as usual. And what's going to happen is we're going to go from a reef that is surviving to a reef that is starting to die. And we're going to end up like this, where reefs can no longer build their carbonate skeletons because the oceans have gone to acid. So this is why what we're facing today is really a triple whammy. It's global warming, but it's also loss of oxygen in our shallow seas and ocean acidification. Now, the reason why looking at the past is so powerful is that it gives us constraints and models on predicting what might happen today. Now, if we look at what I showed you, so first of all, this is the pH change. We were able to measure, as I mentioned, this pH change at this mass extinction, going from actually slightly more alkali down to actually approximately 7.6 pH. And we were able to tell over what period of time that happened. It happened over 10,000 years. Now that might seem very, very slow, but geologically that's extremely rapid change in pH. Now, as I said, modern, here's the pH, say 200 years ago, and here's the pH today. This is the trajectory we are following today. We are going to get, if we carry on as business as usual, a pH of similar to the biggest mass extinction that ever happened in maybe only 500 years. So already what we are doing is following a far more catastrophic pathway than anything that we can find in the geological record of the history of life on the planet. Now, here again is the same time scale. If we burn all the conventional fossil fuels that the Earth has, so that's coal, oil, and gas, it would produce about 5,000 picotons of carbon. If we burn all the unconventional fuels as well, so that's things like tar sands, we reach a figure of this, about 24,000. And that is very, very similar to the amount of CO2 that we model was pumped out naturally by volcanoes in the Permo-Triassic. So in other words, the amount of CO2 pumped out in this mass extinction is similar in the size, in other words, in the order of magnitude to what we're doing today. but we are pumping it out over a much, much, much more rapid, and the trajectory is much, much more rapid. And this is very, very worrying, because basically we know that this was catastrophic for the Earth. This is going to be even more catastrophic, just taking it as in a simple scenario, because it's happening far, far more rapidly. So I suppose the main take-home message for what I'm saying is that if we look into the history of life on our planet, this is the best analog we have of what's happening today. But what's happening today, I think, can be viewed as potentially far more catastrophic than anything we can find in the geological record. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
That was extremely interesting, Rachel. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat or just speak in. I would personally like to know what you think is gonna be the, how do you say, the explode, like the main thing that will like cause the extinction to accelerate even more, like the ocean acidification, or the loss of oxygen, or global warming, or do you think it's everything?
The problem is all these things go hand in hand, but I haven't even talked about other actions of humans: overfishing, pollution. One of the things we're doing as well is that we're pumping a lot of nutrients, like raw sewage, into some of our shallow ecosystems, and things like reefs hate nutrients, and they are being destroyed by that. Building, of course, building produces a lot of runoff and silts. Agricultural runoff produces a huge amount of nutrients. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing in a fish market down south parrotfish, and I asked where they'd come from. And these parrotfish are only found on Pacific reefs. So these fish had been fished from probably Indonesian reefs and found their way to a tiny market in Cambridge. And parrotfish are really, these types of fish are really important to maintain the health of a coral reef ecosystem. I was pretty horrified. So I'm afraid it's not just what I've been talking about. It's all sorts of behaviors of particularly overfishing, pollution, changing land use. I'm sure you are all far more familiar with this than I am. And disentangling, disentangling what's worse than the other is very, very tricky. We obviously, sometimes you can say, okay, this reef is definitely suffering from sewage. This reef is suffering from overfishing. The problem with global warming is that it is a global phenomenon. So even if you have a pristine reef in one place, and so we believe that there are maybe 70 or 80% of our reefs today are supposedly degraded. There are very, very few pristine reefs left. Even if you're in a conservation area and a national park, a marine conservation area, you can't do anything about ocean acidification or global warming, because that is a global phenomenon. The other thing I always think is pretty horrific to read, and I don't know whether you've ever read any of these. I can probably find a reference for you that I read, is if you read the old ship's logs of the first ships that went to the Americas, particularly Captain Cook's, and he arrived in, I'm afraid I can't remember the year, he arrived in Jamaica, and of course at that time wasn't no human population at all. And he talked about the mermaids swimming everywhere, and of course these were manatees and dugongs, which are now really quite rare, but they saw them everywhere. And even more astonishing were the turtles. And there's a piece saying, we got within 100 meters of the shore, and we could have walked on the backs of turtles like stepping stones onto the shore. In other words, these turtles, life is the world. The world was brimming with life, and in just a few hundred years, that was decimated. The turtles were eaten, and the manatees were hunted to not quite near extinction, but very, very low numbers. So I fear that we don't actually have any pristine ecosystems left.
It's horrifying to hear.
It is horrifying. It is horrifying.
Do you think there's that the current pH of the oceans are possibly potentially reversible, or they're irreversible, or do you think there's anything that we could do?
I think it's reversible, but it's got to. We all know we have to do things now very, 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 very rapidly, and we can't just do one thing. We've got to do everything. We've got to start carbon capture and storage. We've got to go to renewable energy very, very rapidly. No more coal. Absolutely no more coal. No more tar sands. We've got to insulate our homes much better. Britain is particularly bad at it. I've got friends in Sweden, and I visited their house built in 1823, and it had triple glazing from 1823. And of course, Swedish winters are far worse than ours, but I thought that was appalling. Britain is the British are renowned for living in chilly, damp, and drafty houses. And you all know these multiple things that we must do, and the technology is really getting there now. And we must not expect, strawberries in December. We've got to eat locally and follow the seasons.
Yeah, it's just going to take something from everyone. Just if everyone does, that'll do it.
Yeah.
Julian has a question. Sorry. Do you think that today's policies are doing enough to stop these dark events from happening?
I don't know enough about, I know about, of course, the Paris Accord, and we've had this terrible situation of a very large nation, which we won't mention, leaving that, but now rejoining. My personal opinion, as you say, is we each now have a ethical responsibility to do our bit.
That's well put.
Yeah. Because I think this is now, it has to be a shared responsibility. And we know also that societies don't always respond well to being told top down what to do. I think it has to be, this is entirely my personal opinion, we have to feel that we want to do something, and then we will, you have to capture people's hearts.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Ryan has a question. Can you provide your thoughts on climate scenarios pathways? What is your assessment of achieving a 1.5 degree or 2 degree climate goal? Quite a hard question.
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Will we achieve it? Will we achieve it? I mean, the problem is there's a lot of uncertainty in the uncertainty envelope in the models. I'm now talking about things I don't really know much about, but I think it would be fair to say that something dramatic has to happen globally for us to certainly to achieve 1.5. I have not seen any models that suggest that we are on track. I mean, I'm old enough to remember I went to a coral reef conference, I think it was 2000, and was it 2000? I think it was, yeah, something like that, but it was the year that the presidential election in the US was between Bush and Gore, and everybody was showing two curves for CO2 emissions and projected global warming, and one was the Bush curve and one was the Gore curve. And the bush curve was far steeper than the Gore curve. And we followed the bush curve. Of course, we followed the bush curve. And that, I thought that was quite an interesting illustration of the importance of governments as well. So having said that, we all have a personal responsibility. Of course, governments have a responsibility and businesses. But, you know, we can't carry on driving cars with hydrocarbons and then blame oil companies. You know, you've got to put your money where your mouth is, really. If you're you know, if we're using hydrocarbons, we're using hydrocarbons. So you must choose personally yourself how much you wish not to use hydrocarbons. But, you know, here I am sitting in the kitchen and this is made of plastic. This is a hydrocarbon.
Hard. Everything is,
yeah.
It's very hard to live your life without things that cause global climate
yeah.
change.
Yeah.
So if you have time for one quick question.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
To what extent are individual citizens responsible for these events versus businesses and governments? From Becky.
Well, I think we're all responsible.
Do you think
all those I mean, I often, I mean, I really am speaking personally here, but we are living in a very wealthy Western society. And if you're living in a wealthy Western society, you are buying in to all that comes with that, and the footprint that comes with that.
Yeah.
Even if you live locally and, you know, eat locally, I fear that probably very, very few of us are not buying products that actually have a high carbon footprint.
It's also very hard because you do need the resources to buy local, organic, good food most of the time, and products that are made with a low CO2 impact. So there's that issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't eat meat, but I was slightly horrified to find that there's a huge issue with soybeans, both in terms of environmental destruction, I mean, and also the carbon footprint. And we've got quite a lot of corn in the freezer, and that's actually not very good in its carbon footprint. And yet I love the idea of growing protein, this mycoprotein in vats. That just really appeals to me, but it turns out not really to be. It's actually not that carbon friendly. So these decisions are complex, and they have to be made individually.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. That was extremely interesting and definitely not something that you normally hear about in climate discussions. I suggest that we take a 5-minute break. Everyone can get a cup of tea or a drink, and then we will move on to Matthew, who will tell us a bit about his ideas and what we can do more about this whole extinction event. So thank you very much again, Rachel.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Great series. Good luck to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, so everyone come back at 7:45, 46, and then we'll move on. All right, everyone. So we are now going to move on to Matthew Woodthorpe, I think. Woodthorpe. I'm saying that wrong. And Matthew works in sustainability education, if I understand that correctly. Maybe Matthew can probably explain it better than I can.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be presenting tonight. So my name is Matt Woodthorpe. The worst I've had a pronunciation was Matt Woodthrob one time, which was, I think, was especially bad. So Thrope, I don't mind. So yeah, I'll just share my screen. I've got a presentation for today. So hopefully, is the presentation up okay?
Yes, it is.
Brilliant. So yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about Scotland's universities, how that relates in terms of sustainability, and also look at student leadership. But just quickly, as a little bit of who EAUC is. So EAUC UK is a national charity that's there to really empower sustainability and sustainability leadership in post-16 education. So we deal with colleges and universities across the UK. And we have a dedicated branch in Scotland that's funded by the Scottish Funding Council. So there's 3 of us up in the team, normally based in Edinburgh, but spread out at the moment. And we're really there to put sustainability in the heart of every campus. It's just good decision making. So yeah, we work on a close basis with every university and college in Scotland. From a bit about my background, so I've been in this post, I'm the program manager for EAC Scotland last year, but as being an introducer at the start, I worked for 3 years as University of Stirling Students' Union's Environmental Development Coordinator, so I did a lot of student-led campaigning and also projects around sustainability. So in this talk, I really want to look at these 3 different areas. So first I'll touch on how university and college relate to sustainability, what is the levers for them to do change. Look at then how students and sustainability relate, and then look at how we can tie it all together and get that middle ground going where students, universities and sustainability all align. So I really want to give a bit of scene setting of what are the key drivers for our university in Scotland to make change. So you're probably all very likely aware that the Climate Change Emission Reduction Act of 2019 sets out that Scotland is to be net zero by all greenhouse gas emissions by at least 2045. Though this is 5 years ahead of the UK, and it's based on the Independent Committee on Climate Change's advice. So in Scotland, we have a much lower population, we have a large landmass, so there's a lot more scope for reforestation and peatland restoration, for example. So that's why there's a difference between the Scottish target of 2045 and the UK target of 2050. And in between, there's a number of interim targets. So for Scotland to achieve a 56% reduction by last year, 75% reduction by 2030, and a 90% reduction by 2045. It's important to note that as of 2018, which is the last public data set we've got, so there'll be more coming out soon, that we actually missed the target of 54%. So we had achieved a 50% reduction, but we missed the 54% target. And that's only 4%, but it's significant. So we need to make some good progress soon. On top of that, the Scottish Government's just released its climate change plan update for 2018 to 2032. And this just sets out the government's framework for how it's going to achieve net zero by 2045, with specific actions focusing up until 2032, including mobilising the £12.6 billion that Scottish public sectors organisations, that's universities, college, NHS, for example, spend, and how they can spend that more efficiently through a circular economy approach. So that's worded in that document. Universities and colleges and wider public bodies won't be able to purchase new petrol or diesel fleet vehicles from 2025. And the next couple of years, there's going to be implementing a net zero carbon standard for all new public buildings. So hopefully, as we heard before, looking at insulation, energy efficiency of our buildings, it is expected that all colleges and universities, anything new would have to be built to a net zero standard. This came out last month, so we put in a consultation response, so it's still getting debated in Scottish Parliament. So we're generally supportive. We think it is ambitious in areas, but there are still big omissions that exist, and there's clarifications that are still needed for public bodies. For example, what does net zero actually mean in a strict definition? At the moment, that's missing. What sources of emissions are to be excluded and excluded? How far do you go from the organizational footprint? And also, for example, are offsets allowed? If so, are they to be international offsets, or is it only in Scotland? So still lots of questions, but generally supportive. The third area I want to flag up with is the public body's climate change duties reporting. So every college and university in Scotland is mandated by law to report their carbon emissions. And what I've done is I've included a link down here, so you could find the University of Edinburgh's report, and you can analyze it. And what you do is you'll get, once you download it, you'll get this screen. And if you click on part 3, you'll find, I think for Edinburgh, the last 10 years of reporting. And what I've done, I just did some calculation myself beforehand. And what we find is that Edinburgh last year, I think, reduced their emissions by 3%. And since reporting was mandatory, which was 2015-16, they reduced it by 13%. In terms of an entire sector, it's important to know how we're doing, not just in individual institutions. So Jill in my team, she analyzes all the responses every year. So we'll be getting the next round in the next few months. And so this is the latest available data. So we got this last year. So universities since 2015 have reduced on average their emissions by 14%, and on a 1-year reduction, 4%. Conversely, colleges did a really good job. They reduced over the same period 23% and 7%. So this is a good way of looking at your institutions. If you're not from Edinburgh, you can also have a look and see actually how is my institution doing compared to this figure? Are we ahead of the curve? Are we behind? And yeah, again, colleges seem to be leading the way. So I just kind of want to touch on, where are all these emissions coming from and what we're reporting. So I've put the data in from 2015-16 all the way to the last public data, which is 2018-19, and we'll be getting, the next lot of data in the next few months. So we have all these things what we call scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 refers to what we call direct emissions. So this is fossil fuels burned on site. So that's, for example, fleet vehicles, so topping up the security van's diesel engine, or burning gas for boiling and heating. It also includes things like F-gas losses, so that's from refrigeration, air conditioning, and land use change. Scope 2 focuses is indirect, but it focuses again on fossil fuels use around purchased electricity, heat, and steam. And scope 3 is classed as indirect emissions for everything else. So that includes business travel, commuting, procurement, water supply and treatment, waste disposal, and recycling. So if we look at the last 4 years, we can see some pretty big trends. In particular, scope 2, that has dropped significantly. So it's almost halved itself in just 4 years. I would like to say this is mostly the work of universities doing a great amount on energy efficiency, but this is actually caused mostly by decarbonisation of the UK grid. So we've shut off coal plants, we're installing a lot more offshore wind, and this is what you're seeing here. In terms of the onward trend, the UK government wants us to reduce the emissions of our electricity by a further 80% by 2035. So if you extrapolated this, if university did absolutely nothing and just kept the same amount of electricity use as they do now, it would still go down to way down here, even if they did nothing. What we see in other areas is scope 1 emissions around heating hasn't changed really. It's actually slightly increased. And this is a really problem area. And you might hear this more and more about how do we decarbonize our heating systems. It's a real challenge. Do we go down an electrical route, storage heaters, or do we go down a hydrogen route? So these are the two main things going in discussions. And it's either way, it's very expensive to rip out that gas system that got put in 40 years ago. So universities are struggling with this. Technology is still emerging, particularly around hydrogen. So we imagine in the next 5 years, we might have some more ideas of what this would look like going forward. And then we have scope 3 emissions, which have increased slightly, but this is more because more and more institutions are reported over the years. So a couple of institutions, for example, didn't report business travel until this last year, and we've seen that increase in trends. But I really want to pick up on the impact of travel in particular, because I think this is one area where institutions can do a lot of good work. So I've put the data of the last year in this table. So Scope 1 emissions accounted for 42% of reported emissions, Scope 2 23%, and Scope 3 is 34%. What we see is business travel actually accounts for nearly 20% of the entire sector's emissions. So that's when senior leaders go on business meetings. It's also when researchers go out to different projects around the world. And this really adds up. 20% of the sector is huge. It's almost the same as all the electricity we're using. And then if we look at that further, we actually see 18.5% nearly is just down to air travel. So again, that's mostly researchers going out and studying and conducting the research. Glasgow Caledonian University was the first university in Scotland to report international student flights. So they said any international student coming to the campus, we presume they fly at the start of and end of each term. So they get 2 flights a year. And this actually is so big that it's almost 2% of the entire sector's emissions. And that's just one university reporting. So we see that travel is a particularly big issue in terms of emissions, but it's also one that particularly business travel we can do a lot with. And yeah, I'd say not all institutions report. So 3 universities still don't report business travel. So this is just the minimum, really. And again, only 1 institution reports this. So this is going to be huge. So this figure of 34% is going to increase. Finally, in terms of that reporting, there are going to be some changes. So the Scottish Government expects from next year that institutions have a date for when they're going to be net zero, that they're going to include targets for these Scope 3 emissions. And I think what's really positive is that they have to show how their institutional spending aligns with meeting these targets. And that's crucial. You're not just having sustainability staff stuck in a stuffy room. They're actually having to go to finance managers, finance directors, and that's not what's happened in the past. So the way organizations will run, I think, will hopefully fundamentally change. So that's a lot about the university side, but in terms of the legal framework, it focuses primarily on carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. But sustainability is not just about carbon. It is about living wage. It's about the black attainment gap, curriculum development, plant-based diets, so accessibility, all these different things. And these are just as crucial, but there isn't that focus necessarily from universities because they don't have that spotlight on them from the Scottish Government. And I think this is a space where students in particular are brilliant at bringing these issues to the forefront. So now I'm going to touch on a bit about this sustainability and student side. So as I said, I worked in a students' union for 3 years. And to me, students, you have the power and the platform to create really positive change. You set cultures within institutions, and that's really important. You can do that through your students' union. You set expectations, and then those are put on the institution itself. I was in a call this afternoon with vice principals for internationalization, and they were saying, students will eventually choose to go to a new university A or B on the basis of their sustainability. And they're recognizing that international students will be seeing that. So they have to act, and that is because of student demand. So I've just flagged up some of these resources here, which we created, and it's about some of the tips for campaigning and a bit more of a background information, which I presented in the presentation. One thing I did in my previous work was we developed a new sustainability strategy for Stirling Students' Union, and actually mapped out the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions from the Students' Union, and we became the first carbon neutral Students' Union in the UK. We're still the only carbon neutral Students' Union in the UK, which is a bit sad. I think the next target for someone is 2030. And we kind of showed Stirling is the second least underfunded Students' Union in Scotland, yet we made it to be carbon neutral. And I think that shows how big value and culture can be in achieving these goals. So again, we've produced a student union, student association emission calculator. So anyone can, in another student's union, can take this and not have to do all the graft and trying to figure out how to work it. So we've got these resources here. So I kind of want to touch on this part of the presentation about some of my key takeaways of campaigning for sustainability from a student perspective. So this is when we announced that we were carbon neutral, and we had ex-minister and Scottish Government joining us, and the Vice Chancellor there. So yeah, at Stirling Students' Union, if anyone has been. So we've got the green and blue space, which is our, their sustainability hub. So we did a number of different projects. So we have the Fair Share scheme on the left-hand side, which is a reuse scheme. So we used to get 6 tons of donations each year. So since it started, we saved about 42 tons of resources from the bin, and those have been reallocated for students. We also did different workshops, also have a food growing space and a community garden, and we had the food hive, which sold zero waste organic food exceptionally cheap, so a lot cheaper than the supermarkets. And these were the achievements, big achievements to date. So the Green Blue Space was set up in 2012. And I think this just really shows the power of students, of how big these things are. So the Green and Blue Space was set up, we achieved to get a community garden, and we lobbied the university to install waste composting at every accommodation on campus. We established the food hive, and so this was supported by funding, I should say, external funding as well. So there is funding out there to help these projects get going. We then lobbied successfully for paperless coursework. So now no one in Stirling submits coursework in paper copy. That saves about £32,000 for students each year, as well as a nice carbon saving paperweight. We do on-campus internal inter-hall energy competitions between residences, and that found students reduce their emissions, their electricity use by about 10% over a year, which is huge. And again, the university saved money on that, and we put that back into sustainability projects that the students could vote on. We installed a coffee cup charge, and in a space of 3 months, the rate of people using reusable cup shot up, as is pretty the same across the UK. About 3% of people use a reusable cup, so 97% is a takeaway cup. In 3 months of putting in this charge in place, that had gone up to 30% of people using it. And it saved about 120,000 disposable coffee cups just in a year. So a really good piece of work. We also secured £50,000 of funding from Cycling Scotland for bike parking. With the period poverty work from the Scottish Government, we successfully lobbied the university to include moon cups in their procurement. I had a surreal argument with one of their procurement staff who was in the Green and Blue Space telling me moon cups are bloody disgusting, no one will ever want them. And I'm glad I stood the ground. We got 160 in, and within 4 hours they'd all gone. So I could go back and say, we'd like some more, please. So yeah, really positive response. And then a year later, we got the university to divest, and finally we achieved our goal of being carbon neutral. So there's a lot there, and again, reiterating, this is the power the student body can bring. And to me, the value students bring is that they put people and community at the heart of sustainability. That's so important. I attend so many meetings where it is just data and data heavy, and you forget to put people in there. And that's the love and energy I get from the student body. So these are a couple of volunteers helping me out on the clear outs. And again, Moon Cup campaign is really, I find it really energizing. So just to touch on some of the key takeaways I found of effective campaigning. I think it's really important to note that campaigns do not happen in isolation, and their structure and success is shaped by a wide range of external factors. And that can be really frustrating. You set out with a goal and it doesn't happen, and that can happen for so many different reasons, and it's not necessarily your fault. So as an example, we're looking at disposable coffee cups as a campaign here. But in the wider context, it looks at so many other things. The experiences of the people you're trying to lobby. So as an example, at Stirling, 2 years ago, they celebrated their 50th year, and they produced a nice book of 50th anniversary at Stirling. And there's only one mention of the Students' Union in that. And that's a famous case of when the Queen came to open up the university 2 years after it started. And there was a guy with a bottle of wine drinking it next to the Queen. And that was the photo they put in the book. And that's what represented the Students' Union. And despite everyone in the university who was there at that time no longer exists in the university, you still have this institutional memory. And that's can be really hard to shake. So the result is often the university didn't take us seriously, when really they should. We're the first carbon neutral students union in the UK, but still it was such a hard process to get them engaged. So sometimes you got to deal with that and legacy issues. Also wider trends, we see so much with after Blue Planet about plastics. So sometimes, it's just easier to jump on a big trend because it gathers momentum as well. Resource and strategies are also really important. Are the things that you're asking for as students align with the institutional strategy? Because if it's not, technically the sustainability staff should only look at what is relevant to the university strategy. And they don't often do that, which is nice, but technically that's what people should be doing. So it's worth having a look at what is in the strategy, because sometimes you can be like, actually, we can improve on that and keep in the same direction. Again, looking at resources, are we proposing something that is just way out of a university's feasibility? It's good to be realistic. From my experience, it's so important to plan a campaign. So really get smart action, you plan your campaigns, be specific of what you as students, your union or university, what you want them to do. Forecast future barriers. My experience was, it was always frustrating working at the Students' Union at times with the university, because I had 4 meetings a year with the Corporate Sustainability Steering Group. They met every 3 months. So if I had a student that's really keen to do something, they only had 4 shots at max to actually get a paper in front of this committee in a year before they may go off and graduate, for example. So what I really found useful is to forecast future barriers. What are the questions university staff are going to ask of me beforehand? Because I might be able to give the data then. What do I expect? I also think it's really important to manage your expectations. So what we used to do with the campaigns is, for example, what is our goal? What is the pinnacle? But then also, what would we take away? What would be the second best or the third best takeaway from this campaign? Because really, your groundwork can be built on by other people in the future. It's also important to understand your key relationships with people and stakeholder motivation. So I found quite quickly that although formally decisions were made at this corporate sustainability group, actually much of the decision making didn't happen in there. It was in the corridors. It's going to someone's office and saying, look, this is a business case we've developed. I'd like you to advocate for it at this meeting. And it was that which secured buy-in for different projects. I found they should be prepared. I was really quite annoyed with this at times, but yeah, be prepared to do a lot of work. You may feel the university and college should be doing this. Edinburgh's lucky that they have a huge social and responsibility team, but other institutions don't. But I think Edinburgh are more than likely to help you a bit more. It's also really important to do regular self and team reflections of campaign. You know, how is it going? Has the wider context changed since we started? Do we need to alter the plan? So I always found like 2 weeks is just a good catch up, 10 minutes. Where are we at? And it's also key to keep everyone in the loop, bring them on the journey. So even if you've got nothing really to say, you know, we're waiting for a meeting, put it out on social media saying, we've developed this paper, we're waiting for the meeting. It's going to be a month's time, but we'll keep you posted. Because it gets people invested in that journey and understanding the processes. One thing I found as well is that, you know, what is that notion of campaigning? It can be a lot of shouting on social media, which is really good. It's really fun. With the Uniboob team, I remember we dangled about 300 bras off the bridge off Stirling, trying to raise awareness for the Uniboob team. So great balance media, but it's also important to remember the importance of non-public campaigning. So this is a business case we developed for trying to get the university to go plastic-free campus with Surfers Against Sewage. So this is the side many students don't see, but it's really important. You know, the university won't accept a project unless we've got this and building the evidence case. So it might be dull, but it's crucial. Yeah, that's the, remember this is a journey. So if you are campaigning, it is a journey. You know, build relationships, and that is not always easy. Remember also that, you know, if you're an environmental officer, for example, someone's going to come after you. So you don't really want to burn bridges, although it's very tempting. You know, when I left Stirling, I was very tempted to cause a ruckus at the end of the meeting, but I recognize another staff member is going to come and help afterwards. But yeah, you know, keep chipping away to create a strong legacy for future work. And I always found that using the SDGs as a really good framework for sustainability and can help a lot internally and externally. You know, using this framework of the SDGs, people who aren't in sustainability can really tie in and see, actually, I'm a student nurse and I recognize I support sustainable development through, you know, good health, for example, and well-being, number 3. So I found that was a really good hook. So I say, you know, there's these 3 different areas of universities, colleges, students, and sustainability. And ideally what we want to do is get universities and students better together and then moving in this direction. And I think there's lots of signs for hope. I think there's still massive challenges. We don't necessarily have all the technology we need to get to net zero, but it's remarkable actually how much we do have. And a lot of the reductions we can make is perception. It's people think, oh, no, that's too hard or it's impossible. It's actually not. It's, it's cultural, it's behavior change. And that to me is the positive thing. It's not waiting for a silver bullet. It's about changing perceptions. And again, your generation, the students who are coming up into university and colleges, they're asking for change. So that's for me something really positive. And I hope in the next 5 years we will see big differences. So I really appreciate it's whistle stop tour, but I'll stop sharing my screen there. Yeah, and welcome for any questions.
That was really great and very helpful actually for us as a society as well. Can definitely pull some of those points into our further programs. Do you think, because before COVID, I guess there was a lot of youth movement and student movement with the whole climate policies and trying to get that to the forefront of people's minds. How strongly do you think does it actually support how we can push the climate policy further or make further change? Or do you think it's just as important or more important to work from within institutions, like go into politics or go into companies and be like, this is what we want to change?
It's a really good question. I think sadly the answer is all of the above. I think we do need to do all of the above, but it's also recognizing that we have a limited capacity. We don't want to burn out either. So it's recognizing, put your energy where you feel you're going to have most impact. I think this year has been really crucial. I'm more positive in a way, which is very sad because the backdrop of this last year, but I'm more positive now for sustainability because of COVID than I was before COVID. And I said that in part in terms of the university sector, because looking at business travel, it shows that a lot of research can happen without business travel. That's happened. Equally, I think Edinburgh, for example, saved about £4 million in air traffic flights. So when you said, oh, there's no money before for sustainability, you could say actually you've reduced your flight emissions to a quarter of what they were the previous year, and you saved £4 million. So that can go into other things. When I'm in meetings, I hear that regularly, students are asking for this, and if there wasn't that push, I don't know if I'd hear it so much. So I think the protests have been fantastic, and I don't think because things are online this last year, that has not let up at all. Things are more sinking in, and I think as I touched on, I had this meeting today with the VP Internationals, and that's the first time they've met. There's 4 of them who set up a working group, a sustainability working group. How do we make international learning sustainable? And that's the first time that group met today, and they're enthusiastic. I'm excited with them. So I think it's really positive. But sometimes as well, it is equally challenging. My colleague, for example, he used to say in their previous job, they worked in a company who she was shocked when she went to get a flight and it was business class, and she called up the company and said, I think you made a mistake. I should be in standard class. And they went, no, that's the case. She was like, okay. And then when she got back, she said, could we set up a thing where, I do it virtually, and the money goes to charity that we would have spent. And because of the company ethos, I went, no, we can't do that. So I think as well, sometimes you do hit these barriers, but equally when you do get into positions of influence, do promote what you believe in. So for me, being in this role, I'm now looking, and COVID, I'm now looking, do we have an office in future? Because lots of our events previous were in person, but now we're saying from September when our lease runs out, no, we're going to hot desk twice a month as a team in Glasgow, and we're going to engage like this, and we can reach more people that way as well. So I think when you do recognize where you can make change and use them.
That's great. Daniel would like to know, can you talk a little bit more about the Carbon Neutral Student Union experience? How did you make it?
Yeah, so it really builds on the work of previous students. So I will put that outlet. So talking about the fair share, for example, so the student recycling, part of the funding condition was that we had to report how much carbon we were saving on that. So we had a really good idea. So I think on the best year, we saved 76 tons of greenhouse gas emissions through that reuse scheme. So we had that data, which kind of got me thinking, like, okay, could we be carbon neutral? I have no idea. So I asked for data on what's our heating use, what's our electricity use, water and waste, as well as our business travel and sports union travel. So this was data that, it's not everything, but it's the main ones, and it's also data we could readily get. So from there, I put in the all the different values. You get government conversion factors, so that's standard across all sectors. So I think it was about 130 tons was our organizational footprint, of which 70 odd was offset through our green and blue space projects. And then we offset the rest with carbon credits of a gold standard. So we did a vetting process for the offsetting. In terms of the offsetting, it's under the value system that we will continue to reduce the carbon emissions we produce. So then over time, we're less reliant on the carbon offsets. But we thought it was a really important flag in the sand and say, actually, as a university, you should take this ethos. You should take this value from us and say, yep, we can't make all the difference now, but you can still make a difference. So that was in a nutshell a bit of the experience we had.
Oliver would like to know, can you say a bit more about disinvestment, i.e. the state of play and what's next in that area?
Oh, good question, and a very difficult one. So I'm going to say I'm no expert, and it's been really interesting to hear how that field has evolved. So when I sort of push for divestment with the union presence, it's very much a value based. We don't want our tuition fees going to endowment policies that promote fossil fuels, and it's really creating a social stigma towards fossil fuels. Alongside that, it actually, lots of data now shows that if you divest and have portfolios without fossil fuels, over the long term, you have no financial risk. They perform just as well as each other. No fossil fuels and fossil fuels. What's been interesting is how, this is kind of an experiment, an ongoing experiment, which I think is also very interesting. But what we've found as well is, when you offload your shares of fossil fuels, someone else buys them. So in the end, there's not necessarily a material financial damage for the fossil fuel companies because someone else buys those shares. I think what's changing now, though, in response to COVID again, is the idea of stranded assets. We've seen, could 2020 be peak oil? I don't know, but it could, saying it could be the next few years after a rebound. And then divestment is another layer to it. It's like, okay, we don't want to be left with these shares which have a lot less value than we bought them. So it's an interesting space. I think some universities, it's better for them not to divest. So I think Aberdeen and Cambridge, for example, maybe at Cambridge, I think is about 3% of their endowment. It's a big endowment, 3 billion, I think, is in fossil fuels. But they say because of their influence, their prestige, they can influence those fossil fuel companies a lot more internally by joining AGMs. Whilst other institutions, which are particularly small, Sterling, will be less so. Aberdeen has a rich history of fossil fuels. So they're saying, actually, we've created these relationships. We've set a net zero target, and we're going to say to these fossil fuel companies, you need to change, you need to invest in renewable energy. And they're going to do it from the inside. So it's a really interesting space, really good question. And there's a lot of detailed research out there, which I've got to be honest, is above my head in terms of finances and stock markets, but it is a really good question.
Yeah, it's definitely quite interesting that you don't know things about certain universities, what they're investing your money in. Becky has a question relating to what you were talking about before. Are the student unions' carbon emissions accounted from a production or a consumption-based perspective?
Great questions. So it would be, in terms of production and consumption, forgive me if I'm wrong, so some of these definitions are debated. So for us, we use a standard Scottish Government conversion factors. So that's something that all the universities do. So in terms of the consumption data, we didn't touch on procurement because which is the consumption side. So procurement emissions are notoriously difficult to map. There's a few ones which are really good. So steel, we can get a good conversion factor for, but just the general everyday thing, whether you buy paper from this company or another company, it can vary quite largely. And on other products, different PCs, what is the embodied carbon? So for that side, at the moment, no institution reports publicly in their public bodies procurement for that reason. They've just developed a whole new tool for that as well. I realize it's expanding on the question, but what we see from that is if we'd included what we estimate to be the procurement emissions from an institution, it'd actually be about 48%, which is absolutely huge. It's all that stuff that we use, all the services, 48% of what emissions universities produce. So it's a really good question. Again, it's just this difficulty of every company will be slightly different. So it's hard to get a figure nailed down. So for in this case, it is production based.
That's definitely good to know. Heather has a great question, which I wish I had thought of myself. Do you think university societies like this one have more power or should focus more on to instigate change in policy, so top down, or behavioral change bottom up?
Okay, I think it would be both. So if you go to an institution and try and lobby for a policy change, they'll say, where's your data? What are you basing on? And that's where you need the behavior change, you need the grassroots stuff. So, but it is a bit of a dance, because I think sometimes it's hard for some people to believe or see what the future change would be like. And that makes for students as well, everybody, it's hard to say, if I make this change, what would actually be all the consequences, positive and negative? So usually what happens is it's kind of an ongoing discussion, and that's why it takes sometimes, a year to get policy through, sometimes even more. So I'd say it's this having both in the court and saying, actually, we've got this idea, we think we're right. Let's say we want to reduce meat consumption in Edinburgh's catering. It might not be a meat-free Monday, that can be controversial, but we could say, why don't we ask the university to reduce the amount of meat used in a dish by 20%? That would have a huge impact. So you as a group could think of that and take that to university, and then they might go, okay, that sounds reasonable. Could you go back and do something more to get wider ideas? So that can be how the relationship develops. So it's not always the case, but usually that's how it happens.
All right, I think that's been all the questions. If anyone has one or two really important questions they want to ask, please type it in. Thank you so much for coming, Matthew, and telling us more about how we can get the community more involved and like us as a society, what we could do to change. I'm just going to mention a few more household items. Again, if anyone wants to run for our sustainability officer, I think Julian will type in until when you can apply, but definitely until the end of the week, and then we'll be voting on applications on Monday. We're also getting involved in a project with the medics in Dundee, which is we are planning a planetary diet model across campuses, which consists of a monthly meal plan where participants the point of the meal plan is to improve local businesses, save environment, and increase healthy eating on campuses. So if you are interested in participating in any way, let us know, or let Julian specifically know. I think Julian will put his email in a bit. And you can get involved in that project. We are also planning on doing a live documentary watching. So look out for that. Follow our social media channels to sign up for that. We have a Facebook, a new Twitter now, so if anyone would like to follow us on Twitter, and an Instagram. And we also have a mailing list, so if you would like to be updated, that's the best place to be. So yeah, actually, someone had a question. Oh yeah, Heather. I tried to get a ticket for the EAUC Degree of Change event in February, but they didn't seem to be is available to non-members.
Yeah, that's who I've just given a quick response. But I say, so EAUC Scotland, we have our conference on the 25th of February. Usually it's in person, but as it's online, we've opened up 100 free tickets to students. So if you are interested in joining, just drop me an email. I can send it, I'll put it in the chat box, and just send me an email, and my colleague Scott will be able to help you out, log on that.
All right, thank you so much again for coming. Thank you to everyone who came. Thank you for all amazing questions, honestly. And you can find us almost on any social media as uoe.fss.soc. So if you type that in somehow or another, it will come up. So thanks everyone, have a wonderful night. Bye.
Cheers.